They laughed at her because she was quiet. They laughed because she was the only woman in the squadron. And they laughed because war had taught them to trust loud confidence over silent instinct. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't need to. In the air, there is no rank, no ego, no second chances. And when the sky finally turned against them, the laughter stopped because she was the only one who saw it coming. Captain Rachel Hayes walked into the briefing room at 05:30, carrying a worn notebook and a thermos of black coffee. The metal folding chair scraped against concrete as she sat in the back row, same seat as always. 3 rows ahead, Captain Derek Vaughn was mid-story, hands cutting through the air like wings. Pulled 7 Gs in that turn, I'm telling you. The bogey never saw it coming. Laughter erupted. Someone clapped. Rachel opened her notebook and began reviewing yesterday's weather patterns. The 44th Fighter Squadron had been operating out of a forward air base for 8 months. Dust covered everything. The tents leaked when it rained. The flight line smelled like jet fuel and desperation. They were down to 16 pilots from the original 24. Replacements came slowly, if at all. Rachel had arrived 4 months ago, transferred from a training wing stateside. The assignment officer had looked uncomfortable when he handed her the orders. "It's a combat rotation," he'd said as if she didn't know. "Yes, sir. You'll be the only—" "I'm aware, sir." That conversation had been repeated, in various forms, approximately 40 times since her arrival. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison, had been direct. "You're here because we need pilots, period. I don't care what you are. I care if you can fly and fight." She appreciated the honesty. What Morrison hadn't said, but what became clear within the first week, was that not caring what she was didn't mean the others wouldn't notice. They noticed. They noticed when she walked into the ready room. They noticed when she suited up. They noticed when she climbed into her aircraft. But they didn't see her. Not really. Major Tom Brennan, the operations officer, glanced back at her now. His eyes skated past, the way they always did. Not hostile, not welcoming, just dismissive. "Hayes, you good for the 0800 sortie?" "Yes, sir." "Good." He turned back to the front. The conversation resumed. Rachel went back to her notebook. She had learned not to expect more. The squadron had its rhythm, and she existed outside it. After the evening sorties, the pilots gathered in the makeshift bar tent with a refrigerator and folding tables. They told stories. They argued about tactics. They bonded over shared danger. Rachel usually went to her quarters and studied. She studied weather patterns over the mountains. She studied enemy radar signatures. She studied the maintenance logs of every aircraft in the squadron. When she did join them at the bar, she sat at the edge and listened. Once Captain Lisa Park from maintenance had asked her why she never told her own stories. "You've got 27 missions. That's more than half these guys." Rachel had shrugged. "They're not that interesting." "Bullshit. I've seen your gun camera footage. It's just flying." Lisa had given her a look that said she didn't believe that, but she'd let it drop. The truth was simpler than Rachel could explain. She'd learned early that being good wasn't enough. Being exceptional drew the wrong kind of attention. And being the only woman meant every mistake was amplified. Every success diminished. So she stayed quiet. She flew her missions. She came back. And she prepared for the next one. Derek Vaughn was a good pilot. Rachel could admit that objectively. He had fast hands, good instincts, and the kind of spatial awareness that couldn't be taught. He also had something Rachel had learned to recognize as dangerous: confidence without humility. "The thing about missile evasion," Derek was saying now, leaning back in his chair, "is that the computer can't account for pilot instinct. You feel the lock, you brake hard, and you trust your gut." Captain Owen Fisher nodded. "How many missiles you evaded now? 5? 6? Derek grinned. "But who's counting?" The group laughed. Rachel kept her eyes on her notes. 6 missiles. She'd evaded 9, but 3 of those hadn't been confirmed kills, so officially it was 6, same as Derek. But she'd never mentioned it, and the intelligence officers who compiled the reports had never thought to announce it. This was the pattern. Derek flew aggressively and talked about it constantly. When he scored a kill, everyone knew within the hour. When he took damage, it became a story of skill and survival. When he made a mistake, it was bad luck or equipment failure. When Rachel scored a kill, it went in the log. When she took damage, it was noted. When she made a mistake, it was proof she didn't belong. She'd realized this during her second week. They'd been flying a defensive counter-air patrol, 4 aircraft in a standard formation. She'd called out a radar contact at 30 miles, low altitude, tracking north. "Probably a ghost return," Major Brennan had said. "Terrain clutter." She'd marked it in her notebook but said nothing more. 20 minutes later, the contact was confirmed as hostile. Yeah. By then, it had closed to 12 miles before being intercepted by another flight. Brennan had never mentioned it. Rachel had, in her notebook, along with the terrain profile, the radar settings, and the weather conditions that had caused the clutter. Because the next time terrain clutter appeared, she'd know the difference. This was her method. No stories, no chest beating, just data, just preparation. The other pilots interpreted this as lack of engagement. Lieutenant Aaron Cross had said it once, not unkindly. "You're like a ghost, Hayes. You fly with us, but you're not really here." She'd wanted to say, "I'm more here than any of you. I see every pattern you miss. I know which of you pulls too hard in turns because your G tolerance is dropping. I know Owen's radar is miscalibrated by 0.3 degrees. I know Derek's overconfident because he hasn't been scared yet." Instead, she'd said, "I'm here." Aaron had shrugged and walked away. Now, in the briefing room, Morrison entered and the noise died. He moved to the front, carrying a folder stamped with red classification markings. "Listen up. We've got a priority tasking, high-value target, time-sensitive. I need 8 aircraft airborne at 1400. He opened the folder and began outlining the mission. Rachel listened, her pen moving across the page. Target coordinates, expected defenses, weather window, egress routes, and then something else, something that didn't fit. Morrison pointed to the map projected on the wall. "We'll ingress from the southwest, follow the valley to mask our approach, then pop up at the initial point for weapons delivery. Total time over target, 90 seconds. Then we egress east, stay low, and return to base." Rachel's pen stopped. The valley ran northeast to southwest. The winds at altitude, according to this morning's meteorological report, were gusting from the west at 40 knots. If they followed the valley southwest to northeast, they'd have a headwind on ingress slow and predictable. But the egress to the east would push them directly into a known surface-to-air missile engagement zone during the time when they'd be slowest and most vulnerable. She raised her hand. Morrison paused. "Hayes?" "Sir, the winds aloft are going to push us off course on the egress. If we come out to the east at low altitude with a crosswind, we'll drift into the SAM umbrella near grid Echo 7. Derek turned in his seat. The mission planning cell already accounted for winds. "I reviewed this morning's update. The forecast changed. Wind speed increased." Morrison looked at his folder. "The brief I have shows 20-knot winds." "That was yesterday's forecast, sir. This morning's update pushed it to 40. Major Brennan leaned forward. "Hayes, we've run this profile a dozen times. The egress route is solid." "Not with these winds, sir." Owen Fisher muttered something Rachel didn't quite catch. Someone snickered. Morrison closed the folder. "We'll stick to the plan. The weather's been unpredictable all week. If it changes again, we'll adapt in flight. The mission timing is fixed. We don't have flexibility to replan." Rachel held his gaze for a moment, then looked down at her notebook. She drew a small asterisk next to the egress route and wrote 40 kT wind 3 to drift at 480 kts GSE Echo 7 SAM range. Morrison continued the briefing. Rachel stopped listening to his words and started calculating. If the formation held exactly 480 knots ground speed on egress, and if the crosswind was precisely 40 knots, and if they maintained current heading for 2 minutes, she sketched the geometry. The drift would put them within range of the SA-15 battery that intelligence had marked as active. Not a certainty, but a risk, a preventable risk. When the briefing ended, the pilot stood and filed out. Derek clapped Owen on the shoulder. 90 seconds over target. In and out, like a surgeon. Owen agreed. Rachel tucked her notebook under her arm and walked toward the door. Lisa Park was waiting outside, leaning against the corrugated metal wall. "You tried," Lisa said. "Doesn't matter. It will if you're right." Rachel didn't answer. She'd learned that being right without being listened to was the same as being wrong. The only difference was in her notebook, where the data would remain, waiting to prove itself one way or another. She had 4 hours until the mission. She spent them reviewing radar signatures and studying the terrain around grid Echo 7. Rachel's father had been a crop duster in Nebraska. He'd taught her to fly in a 1972 Cessna that rattled like a paint mixer and smelled like pesticide. She'd been 11. "Flying isn't about the stick," he'd said. "It's about reading the air. The sky tells you everything if you listen." She'd learned to listen. She'd learned that wind didn't just blow it curved around hills, accelerated through valleys, created pockets of shear that could flip an aircraft if you weren't ready. She'd learned that clouds weren't decoration. They marked fronts, inversions, moisture gradients that changed how engines performed and how wings generated lift. She'd learned that the smallest details mattered. At the Air Force Academy, her instructors had called her methodical. During pilot training, they'd called her cautious. In her first operational squadron, they'd called her overthinking. She'd stopped trying to explain that she wasn't cautious, she was prepared. There was a difference. Caution was fear. Preparation was respect. Respect for the machine. Respect for the environment. Respect for the enemy. She'd made mistakes. Everyone did. But her mistakes had taught her something the confident pilots never learned. The difference between luck and skill was preparation, and luck always ran out first. Her worst mistake had come during her second combat deployment, 3 years ago. She'd been flying with a different squadron, a different war. The mission had been simple: escort a reconnaissance aircraft through a low-threat area. She'd noticed the radar contact early. Single aircraft, high altitude outside the mission area, probably neutral. Possibly commercial, probably. She'd considered calling it in, but the mission commander was busy coordinating with ground forces. The contact was distant. Her radar had been glitchy all week. She'd decided to wait. 30 seconds later, the contact descended rapidly and launched a missile at the reconnaissance aircraft. The recon crew had survived barely. The pilot had lost an eye. Rachel had filed the report herself. She'd included every detail. The conclusion was clear. She'd had information that could have prevented the attack, and she'd hesitated. The squadron commander had been understanding. These things happen in combat. You can't call out every radar blip. But Rachel knew better. She could have. She should have. After that, she never hesitated again. She called every contact. She noted every anomaly. She tracked every detail. And if people thought she was paranoid or overcautious, that was fine, because the recon pilot with one eye would never fly again, and Rachel would never give luck another chance to run out. Now, sitting in her quarters, she reviewed her notes on the afternoon mission. The winds, the terrain, the SAM threat. She'd done everything she could. If she was wrong, no one would mention it. If she was right, she closed the notebook. It didn't matter. In 4 hours, she'd know. The flight line was organized chaos. Crew chiefs swarmed over aircraft, performing final checks. Ordnance teams loaded missiles with careful precision. The air smelled like jet fuel and hot metal. Rachel walked around her F-16, performing her own inspection. She checked the missiles, the fuel tanks, the control surfaces. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Paul Hendricks, watched with patient amusement. "You know I already checked all that, ma'am." "I know. And you're going to check it anyway." "Yes," he grinned. "Every single time." Every single time. She climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The seat fit like a second skin. She ran through the startup sequence, feeling the aircraft come alive around her. The heads-up display flickered on. The radar initialized. The weapon system armed. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Python flight, check in." One by one, the pilots responded. Rachel was Python 4. "Python 4 ready." "Python flight, taxi." 8 aircraft rolled forward in sequence. The tower cleared them for takeoff. Rachel watched Derek's aircraft ahead of her, the heat shimmer from his engines distorting the air. They lifted off in pairs, climbing into a sky that was almost too clear. Perfect visibility. Light winds at altitude for now. Rachel checked the weather data on her mission computer. The forecast hadn't changed. 40 knots from the west. They formed up at 15,000 feet. 8 aircraft in a loose combat spread. Morrison led from Python 1. Derek flew Python 2. Owen was Python 3. Rachel held position as Python 4. The flight to the initial point took 18 minutes. Rachel monitored her systems, checked her fuel state, scanned the radar display. Everything nominal. The terrain below changed from desert to foothills to mountains. They descended into the valley, dropping to 500 feet above the ground, the rock walls rising on either side. Morrison's voice, "Python flight, arm weapons, 30 seconds to IP." Rachel selected her air-to-ground missiles and watched the targeting system lock onto the coordinates. 20 seconds. 10 seconds. "Python flight, pull." As I pull. The formation climbed sharply, popping up from the valley floor. The target appeared on Rachel's display, a command bunker dug into the side of a mountain. Her targeting computer tracked it, calculated the release point. Python lead, rifle. Morrison's missile streaked away. The other pilots followed in sequence. Rachel's turn came, and she fired, feeling the aircraft lurch as the missile dropped away. Then they were diving back down, hugging the terrain, racing east. Rachel checked her navigation display. Ground speed, 485 knots. Wind correction, drifting north. She keyed her radio. "Python lead, winds are pushing us north. Recommend heading adjustment." No response. "Python lead, acknowledge." Morrison's voice came back clipped and busy. "Python 4, maintain formation." Rachel watched her display. The drift continued. They were tracking toward grid Echo 7. She checked her threat receiver. Nothing yet, but they were only 30 seconds into the egress. She counted down silently. 40 seconds. 50. At 1 minute, her threat receiver chirped. "Radar emissions. SA-15 system. Searching. Not locked. Python flight. Threat bearing 090. SA-15 search radar. Derek's voice. Confirmed. They don't have us yet. But they would, because they were still drifting. Rachel ran the calculation again. At current drift rate, in 30 seconds they'd be within optimal engagement range. Python lead. Recommend immediate heading adjustment south. The drift is putting us in the threat ring. Python 4, maintain formation. We're almost clear. They weren't. Rachel watched the threat display. The radar emissions strengthened. The SAM system was tracking multiple targets now, refining its solution. 20 seconds to engagement range. She made her decision. Rachel broke left, away from the formation, simultaneously dropping chaff and flares. Her threat receiver screamed as the SA-15 system locked onto the formation. Python flight, break left now, SAM's in the air. The sky erupted. 2 missiles streaked up from the valley to the north, their smoke trails white against the blue. They were tracking Python 2 and Python 3, Derek and Owen. Morrison's voice sharp. All aircraft, break, defensive. The formation scattered. Rachel pulled hard, her vision graying at the edges as G-forces crushed her into the seat. She watched her countermeasures deploy, bright flashes of heat and clouds of chaff. Derek's voice strained. Missile tracking. I'm defensive. The first SAM lost lock, confused by chaff. It detonated harmlessly 200 feet from Derek's aircraft. The second missile stayed locked on Owen. Rachel watched it track, watched Owen's aircraft jinking desperately. He was pulling too hard, bleeding energy. The missile was closing. She acted on instinct. Python 3, level your wings and accelerate, then brake right on my mark. What? Do it. Trust me. Owen leveled out. The missile adjusted, closing fast. Rachel counted seconds, calculated the intercept geometry. Brake right now! Owen snapped right. The missile, committed to its trajectory, couldn't turn fast enough. It passed behind Owen's aircraft and detonated, the shrapnel missing by 50 yards. The radio exploded with voices. Status! Python 2, good. Python 3, good. What the hell? Morrison's voice cut through. Python flight, reform and egress south. Python 4, nice call. They turned south, away from the threat ring, and accelerated. Rachel checked her systems. All green. Her fuel state was lower than planned. The defensive maneuvering had burned through reserves, but acceptable. The flight back to base was silent, except for required radio calls. When they landed, the crew chiefs were waiting with worried faces. Rachel climbed down from her aircraft, legs shaky from adrenaline come down. Derek was walking toward her across the ramp. His face was unreadable. You broke formation, he said. Yes, you were right about the winds. Rachel nodded. Derek extended his hand. Thank you. She shook it. His grip was firm. Owen appeared, still in his flight suit, face pale. You saved my life. You did the flying. But you. He stopped, seeming to search for words. How did you know when to call the brake? Geometry. The missile's turn radius at that speed and altitude. You needed to force it into an overshoot. Owen stared at her. You calculated that in your head? While flying? It's just physics. Morrison approached, pulling off his helmet. Hayes, debrief in 30 minutes. I want to know exactly what you saw and when. Yes, sir. He walked away. Rachel collected her gear and headed toward the ready room. Lisa Park was waiting by the door. I heard the radio calls, Lisa said. You called it in the briefing. It doesn't matter. The hell it doesn't. You told them the winds were wrong and they didn't listen, and you saved their asses anyway. Rachel shouldered her back. That's the job. It shouldn't be. Rachel didn't answer. She went to her quarters, sat on her bunk, and opened her notebook. She documented everything. The actual wind speeds, the drift rate, the timing of the SAM launch, Owen's energy state, the missile's flight profile. Data for the next time, because there was always a next time. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Morrison led it, with the squadron intelligence officer taking notes. They watched the gun camera footage, reviewed the radar tracks, analyzed every decision. When they reached the moment Rachel broke formation, Morrison paused the playback. Hayes, walk me through your decision process here. Rachel pointed to the display. At this point, I'd been tracking our drift for 90 seconds. The winds were consistent with my calculation from the morning weather update. I knew we were entering the SA-15's optimal engagement envelope. The threat receiver confirmed radar emissions at the expected time. When the emissions shifted from search to track mode, I knew we had approximately 15 seconds before missile launch. And you broke formation without clearance? Yes, sir. Why? Because waiting for clearance would have put us inside the minimum reaction time. The missiles launched 8 seconds after I broke. If I'd waited for clearance, we would have been defensive inside the envelope with degraded maneuverability. The intelligence officer leaned forward. How did you know the missiles would launch at that specific time? I didn't know. I assessed it as the highest probability outcome based on our position and the SAM system's typical engagement profile. Morrison studied her. You gambled. I calculated, sir. There's a difference. Explain. Rachel chose her words carefully. A gamble is a decision made with incomplete information and accepted risk. I had complete information: winds, drift rate, threat emissions, formation position. The risk wasn't in my decision. The risk was in not making it. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Agreed. Your actions prevented what would likely have been a catastrophic outcome. Python 3 would almost certainly have been hit, possibly destroyed. He closed the folder. I'm recommending you for a commendation. But more importantly, I'm making a change. From now on, you're part of the mission planning cell. Every mission gets reviewed by you before we brief. Rachel blinked. Sir? You see things the rest of us miss. That's valuable. I should have listened in the briefing room. I won't make that mistake again. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Morrison stood. Dismissed. Rachel walked out into the evening air. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. She could hear voices from the bar tent, laughter and conversation. For the first time in 4 months, she walked toward it. The tent was crowded. Pilots clustered around the tables, plastic cups in hand, reliving the day's mission with the animation that came from surviving danger. Rachel stood in the doorway, uncertain. She'd been in this tent dozens of times, but always at the edges, always separate. Derek saw her first. He stood and raised his cup. Hayes! The tent went quiet. Rachel tensed. Derek crossed to her, still holding his drink. You drink beer? Sometimes. He handed her his cup. This one's yours, you earned it. Owen appeared at Derek's shoulder. She earned a hell of a lot more than a beer. The other pilots were watching now. Major Brennan came over, his expression serious. I owe you an apology, Hayes. You called it in the briefing and I shut you down. That was wrong. Rachel didn't know what to say. You couldn't have known. You knew, and I didn't listen. He extended his hand. It won't happen again. She shook it. Aaron Cross pulled out a chair. Sit. Tell us how you calculated that break call for Owen. I've been trying to figure out the geometry and I can't make it work. Rachel sat. She pulled out her notebook, she always had it, and opened to a page of diagrams. The missile's turn radius is limited by its control surfaces and velocity. At Mach 2.5, which is typical for an SA-15 in endgame, the minimum turn radius is approximately. She sketched the geometry, explaining the physics. The pilots leaned in, asking questions, real questions, technical questions. Owen shook his head. You did all this math in about 3 seconds while pulling G's and dispensing countermeasures? The math was already done. I've studied SA-15 intercept profiles. I just applied the model. Derek laughed. Just applied the model. Jesus, Hayes. But it wasn't mocking. It was respect. The conversation shifted to other topics. The target, the egress route, tomorrow's schedule. Rachel found herself answering questions, offering observations, being included. Not as the only woman, not as an outsider, just as a pilot. It was strange, unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Later, when the tent began to empty, Lisa Park appeared at Rachel's elbow. This is different. Yeah. How does it feel? Rachel considered the question. I don't know yet. Lisa smiled. Well, you saved their lives today. They're going to remember that. Maybe. Definitely. Lisa stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, you've always belonged here. They're just figuring it out now. Rachel watched her go, then looked down at her notebook. The pages were filled with data, calculations, observations. 4 months of silent preparation. She'd never needed their acceptance to do her job. But having it, that was different. She closed the notebook and finished her beer. Morrison called Rachel into his office 3 days later. She entered to find him reviewing mission reports, a cup of coffee cooling on his desk. Sit, he said without looking up. She sat. He finished reading, then set the folder aside. You've been doing something I didn't notice until now. Sir, you've been keeping detailed notes on every mission flown by the squadron, not just your own, everyone's. Rachel's stomach tightened. Yes, sir. The maintenance officer mentioned it, said you've been cross-referencing aircraft performance with pilot behavior, tracking patterns. I wasn't trying to. Morrison raised a hand. I'm not criticizing. I'm asking why. Rachel hesitated. Because patterns matter, sir. If a pilot consistently pulls harder in turns than necessary, it means their G tolerance might be degrading. If an aircraft's radar has consistent alignment issues, it affects targeting accuracy. If we always egress through the same valley, the enemy will learn to predict it. And you've been tracking all of this? Yes, sir. Morrison leaned back. Show me. Rachel opened her notebook. She showed him the pattern she'd identified. Derek's aggressive turn entries, Owen's tendency to fixate on single targets, Aaron's excellent radar work but poor fuel management, aircraft maintenance trends, weather pattern analysis, enemy tactics evolution. Morrison studied the pages in silence. Finally, he said, This is intelligence level analysis. It's just observation, sir. No, it's not. He closed the notebook and handed it back. This is the kind of thinking that keeps people alive, the kind of thinking I need from all my pilots, not just one. He paused. War doesn't care about confidence. It doesn't care about bravado. It doesn't care who tells the best stories in the bar tent. It cares about one thing: who sees reality clearly and who doesn't. Rachel met his gaze. Morrison continued, "For 4 months, you saw reality clearly and we ignored you. That ends now. I'm making you the squadron tactics officer. You'll review every mission, identify risks, and make recommendations, and this time people will listen. Sir, I'm the most junior captain in the squadron. You're also the best analyst we have. Rank doesn't mean much if you're dead because you missed something obvious." He stood. "The job is yours if you want it." Rachel thought about all the times she'd been ignored, dismissed, laughed at. Not out of malice, but out of assumption. The assumption that quiet meant incompetent, that different meant less. She'd never argued against those assumptions. She just kept working, kept preparing, kept seeing. "I'll take it, sir." Morrison nodded. "Good. First task, review tomorrow's patrol routes. I want your assessment by 1800. "Yes, sir." She stood to leave. "Hayes?" She turned. "They're listening now because you saved lives, but you earned the right to be heard 4 months ago. I'm sorry it took a crisis for me to see that." Rachel didn't know what to say, so she nodded and left. Outside, the flight line was busy with afternoon operations. She watched an F-16 launch, the afterburners roar splitting the air. The aircraft climbed steeply, rolled inverted, then disappeared into the sun. Beautiful, dangerous, unforgiving. Like everything in war, she opened her notebook and began reviewing tomorrow's mission plans. 6 weeks later, the squadron gathered for a change of command ceremony. Morrison was rotating back to the States. His replacement, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chin, was experienced and sharp. During the ceremony, Morrison gave a speech. He talked about the squadron's accomplishments, the challenges they'd faced, the people who'd made it possible. Near the end, he said something unexpected. "This squadron learned an important lesson recently. We learned that the best voice in the room isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes it's the quietest, the one that watches while others talk, the one that prepares while others rest, the one that sees what others miss." He looked directly at Rachel. "Captain Hayes taught us that lesson, not with words, with actions. And because she was patient enough to let us learn it the hard way, we're all still here to benefit from it." After the ceremony, Derek approached her. "You know what's different now?" "What?" "When you walk into the briefing room, people pay attention. When you speak, people listen. That's earned, Hayes, not given." Rachel smiled slightly. "I didn't do anything different. That's what makes it earned." The squadron continued operating. Rachel continued analyzing, preparing, watching. But now, when she raised her hand in briefings, Morrison and then Colonel Chin stopped and listened. When she noted an anomaly, people investigated. When she recommended a change, it was implemented. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded it, but because they learned. 3 months after the Sam incident, Rachel was promoted to major. The ceremony was small, held on the flight line at sunset. Her parents flew in from Nebraska. Her father, older now but still straight-backed, pinned on her new rank. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. Her mother had died when Rachel was 16. "I hope so." "She would. You learned to read the sky, just like I taught you." After the ceremony, the squadron threw a party. Rachel stood with Lisa Park watching the pilots tell stories. Derek was mid-narrative, hands cutting through the air. "And I'm pulling 7 Gs, the missiles tracking, and Hayes comes on the radio, calm as anything, tells me exactly when to break." Lisa laughed. "They're going to be telling that story for years." "Probably. Does it bother you that it took almost dying for them to listen?" Rachel watched the pilots, saw the respect in their eyes when they glanced her way. Not because she was different, because she was good. "No," she said finally, "because they're listening now. That's what matters. You're more forgiving than I would be." Rachel shook her head. "It's not forgiveness. It's just reality. In war, you don't learn by being told. You learn by paying attention. Some people need a bigger lesson than others, but they learned." She paused. "And they won't forget." Lisa raised her cup. "To lessons learned." Rachel touched her cup to Lisa's. "To lessons learned." That night, alone in her quarters, Rachel opened her notebook to a fresh page. She began documenting the day's flights, the patterns she'd observed, the small details that might matter tomorrow, or next week, or next month. Outside, she could hear laughter from the bar tent. She smiled and kept writing, because this was who she was. Not the loud one, not the storyteller, the observer, the analyst, the one who saw. And in war, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. In war, respect is not given. It is learned too late or just in time.